Between 1917 and 1928, something happened that doctors still can't explain. A disease appeared out of nowhere and swept across the entire world. It didn't discriminate. Rich, poor, young, old, it took them all. The symptoms were terrifying. People would fall asleep and simply never wake up. Some slept for days, others for weeks, some for decades. But here's what makes it worse. Many victims weren't asleep at all. They were conscious, trapped inside their own bodies, unable to move, unable to speak, like living statues. At its peak, this disease infected over 1 million people worldwide. Then, just as mysteriously as it appeared, it vanished. By 1928, new cases stopped. No cure was ever found. No definitive cause was ever identified. And here's the truly unsettling part. We have no idea if it could come back. This is the story of Encephalitis lethargica, the sleeping sickness that the world forgot. And after you hear what happened, you'll understand why some doctors are still watching, still waiting, terrified that history might repeat itself. The year is 1916. World War I is tearing Europe apart. In the chaos of war, people are dying by the thousands every day from bullets, gas, disease. So when a few patients in Vienna start exhibiting strange symptoms, nobody pays much attention at first. A Romanian neurologist named Constantin von Economo is working in Vienna when these patients start arriving at his clinic. They complain of extreme fatigue, fever, and overwhelming sleepiness. But this isn't normal sleep. These people are falling into deep, almost coma-like states. Some can be roused briefly, only to immediately fall back into unconsciousness. Von Economo is brilliant, meticulous. He starts documenting everything. He notices something disturbing. This isn't just affecting the brain's sleep centers. Patients are developing strange eye movements, their eyes rolling upward or moving independently. Some develop muscle rigidity. Others experience wild, uncontrollable movements. By 1917, the disease explodes. It's not just Vienna anymore. Cases appear in France, then England, then across the Atlantic to North America. Within months, it's global. Australia, Asia, Africa, South America, nowhere is spared. The press starts calling it sleepy sickness or the sleeping disease. Medical journals scramble to document this new epidemic. But here's what makes it different from anything doctors have seen before. The symptoms are wildly inconsistent. Imagine you're a doctor in 1918. Patient arrives at your hospital. They have encephalitis lethargica. But what does that actually mean? Because this disease has so many faces, you genuinely don't know what's about to happen to them. Some patients, and these are the ones who gave the disease its name, fall into that deep sleep. They're not in a coma exactly. You can wake them up briefly. You can get them to drink water to answer simple questions. But the moment you stop stimulating them, they're gone again, back into that dark sleep. Hours turn into days. Days turn into weeks. Some of these patients sleep for months before they finally wake up. Or don't. But other patients experience something completely different. They don't sleep at all. Instead, they become hyperactive, manic, unable to rest. They're consumed by insomnia. Their minds racing. Their bodies in constant motion until they collapse from exhaustion. And then there's the third group. And honestly, these are the most disturbing cases. These patients don't fall asleep. They're fully conscious, but they can't move. It's called post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, though doctors didn't call it that back then. These people are frozen. Their faces become mask-like, expressionless. Their bodies rigid. They can see, they can hear, they can think, but they're trapped. Imagine being locked inside your own body. You're aware of everything happening around you. You can hear your family crying at your bedside. You want to reach out to tell them you're still in there, but your body won't respond. Your face won't form expressions. Your mouth won't make words. You're a prisoner in your own flesh. Some of these frozen patients would remain conscious in this state for years, decades, even just waiting, experiencing every single moment of every single day, unable to do anything about it. By 1920, Encephalitis lethargica has infected over 1 million people worldwide. The death toll is staggering. somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people dead in just a few years. For perspective, that's comparable to the casualties of the 1918 Spanish flu in terms of its immediate impact, though the flu killed far more overall. But here's what makes encephalitis lethargica arguably worse. Death might have been the mercy. Because while about half of all patients either died or recovered within the acute phase, the other half survived into something that couldn't really be called living. Hospitals and asylums fill with these frozen people. Some are children, kids who were playing in the streets one day and turned to living statues the next. Parents watch their children disappear inside themselves. Spouses lose their partners not to death, but to something perhaps worse, a strange half-existence between life and death. The medical community is desperate. They try everything: bloodletting, vaccines, experimental surgeries, various drugs. Nothing works. Nothing even comes close. Doctors can't cure it because they can't understand it. They can't even agree on what's causing it. So what was causing this nightmare? Konstantin von Economo and other neurologists start investigating. They perform autopsies on victims who died from the disease. What they find is inflammation in the brain, particularly in specific regions, the substantia nigra, the basal ganglia, areas that control movement and sleep-wake cycles. But inflammation from what? That's the million-dollar question. And in 1918, with World War I still raging, with limited medical technology, with microscopes that can't see viruses clearly, scientists are shooting in the dark. The timing is suspicious. Encephalitis lethargica emerges in 1916 to 1917, right alongside the Spanish flu pandemic. The Spanish flu kills somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. It's one of the deadliest disease outbreaks in human history. And here's encephalitis lethargica, appearing at the exact same time. Many doctors immediately suspect a connection. Maybe it's the same virus. Maybe it's a mutation. Maybe the flu virus is somehow triggering this neurological disease in certain people. The correlation seems too perfect to be coincidence. But there are problems with this theory. For one thing, not all encephalitis lethargica patients had the flu first. In fact, many showed no signs of influenza at all before developing the sleeping sickness. The two diseases also had very different mortality patterns and geographical spreads in some regions. Still, the virus theory persists. Modern researchers have gone back, looking at preserved brain tissue from victims, trying to find viral RNA or DNA that might give us answers. Some studies claim to have found influenza genetic material in the brains of encephalitis lethargica patients. Others find nothing. The debate continues today. Here's a scarier possibility. What if there was no external pathogen? What if the body was attacking itself? In recent years, scientists have discovered something called autoimmune encephalitis. Basically, in some people, the immune system malfunctions and starts attacking the brain. It mistakes healthy brain tissue for an invader and launches an assault. The result? Inflammation, neurological symptoms, changes in behavior and consciousness. Some modern researchers think encephalitis lethargica might have been an autoimmune condition, possibly triggered by an infection, maybe the flu, maybe something else, that caused the immune system to go haywire in certain individuals. This would explain why the symptoms were so variable. Autoimmune diseases are notoriously inconsistent in how they present. There's some evidence for this. Patients with certain autoimmune markers today sometimes develop symptoms eerily similar to encephalitis lethargica. In fact, there's a modern condition called anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis that can cause similar psychiatric and neurological symptoms, including catatonia and movement disorders. But if it was autoimmune, why did it appear suddenly in 1916? Why did it affect so many people so quickly? And why did it stop? Some researchers have proposed that maybe it wasn't a disease in the traditional sense at all. Maybe it was an environmental toxin. Something in the air, the water, the food supply. World War I saw the widespread use of chemical weapons for the first time in history. Mustard gas, chlorine gas, phosgene, these substances poison millions of soldiers and civilians. Could exposure to these chemicals or to industrial pollutants have caused a neurological epidemic? The problem with this theory is geography. Encephalitis lethargica appeared in places far removed from the battlefields of Europe. Australia had cases. South Africa, remote regions of Asia. It's hard to imagine an environmental toxin spreading so widely and then completely disappearing. Here's a more recent and somewhat compelling theory. What if it was caused by Streptococcus bacteria, the same bacteria that causes strep throat? We know that streptococcal infections can sometimes trigger autoimmune responses. There's a condition called PANDAS, pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disorders associated with streptococcal infections, where kids develop sudden obsessive-compulsive symptoms or tics after a strep infection. It's rare, but it's real. Some researchers think Encephalitis lethargica might have been a massive outbreak of strep-triggered autoimmune encephalitis. This would explain the timing. Strep bacteria were everywhere, especially in crowded wartime conditions. It would explain the variable symptoms. Autoimmune diseases are inconsistent. And it would explain why it stopped. Perhaps the strain of Streptococcus that was triggering the response evolved or died out. But again, this is just a theory. We don't have definitive proof. So which theory is correct? After more than a century of investigation, the honest answer is, we don't know. We might never know. The victims of Encephalitis lethargica are long dead. The tissue samples we have are degraded. The medical records from the 1920s are incomplete and often contradictory. What we do know is this. Something attacked the brains of over 1 million people. It caused inflammation in specific regions that control movement, sleep, and behavior, killed hundreds of thousands, and then it disappeared. Maybe it was a virus that went extinct. Maybe it was an autoimmune condition that no longer gets triggered in the same way. Maybe it was something we still don't understand. Or maybe, and this is what keeps some doctors up at night, maybe it's still out there dormant, waiting for the right conditions to return. By 1928, new cases of Encephalitis lethargica have virtually stopped appearing. The epidemic is over. The world breathes a collective sigh of relief and moves on. But the survivors don't get to move on. Throughout the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, tens of thousands of post-encephalitic patients remain in hospitals and asylums around the world. These are the frozen ones, the living statues. They're maintained by staff, fed through tubes when necessary, kept clean and comfortable. But they're not really there. Not in any meaningful sense. Imagine visiting one of these wards in 1950. You walk down a corridor lined with patients sitting in chairs or lying in beds. First, you might think they're sleeping. But as you look closer, you realize their eyes are open. They're not asleep. They're awake. But they don't move. They don't speak. They barely blink. Some of them have been like this for 20 years, 30 years. They were teenagers when they got sick. Now they're middle-aged. Their youth stolen. Their lives frozen in amber at the moment the disease took them. The medical community doesn't know what to do with these patients. Are they brain damaged? Are they conscious? What's happening inside their heads? Technology in the 1950s isn't advanced enough to answer these questions. So the patients sit and wait, and the world forgets about them. Then, in 1969, something extraordinary happens. A young neurologist named Oliver Sacks starts working at Beth Abraham Hospital in the Bronx, New York. The hospital has a ward dedicated to post-encephalitic patients. Sacks is fascinated by these frozen people. He spends time with them, observing them closely, and he notices something that other doctors have missed. They're not completely unresponsive. There are small signs of awareness, a flicker of the eyes, a slight movement in response to music or a familiar voice. Sacks becomes convinced that these patients are conscious, that they're trapped inside their frozen bodies, aware of everything happening around them. He wants to help them. He wants to bring them back. At this time, a new drug called L-Dopa is showing promise in treating Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's, like post-encephalitic Parkinsonism, involves the death of dopamine-producing neurons in the brain. Sacks wonders, could L-Dopa help his frozen patients? In 1969, he begins administering L-Dopa to his patients. The results are miraculous. Patients who haven't moved in decades suddenly start waking up. A woman who's been frozen since 1926, 43 years, begins to speak. Her voice is hoarse from decades of disuse, but she's talking. She's moving. She's crying tears of joy. One by one, the frozen patients awaken. They can walk again. They can hug their families. For the first time in decades, they're alive again in every sense of the word. Sachs documents everything in his book Awakenings, published in 1973. It's a triumphant story of medical breakthrough and human resilience. Later, it's adapted into a film starring Robert De Niro and Robin Williams. The world celebrates. But here's what the movie doesn't fully show you. The awakening doesn't last. Within weeks or months of starting L-Dopa treatment, the patients begin developing terrible side effects. Uncontrollable movements, hallucinations, manic episodes. The drug that brought them back is now tormenting them. Sachs tries adjusting dosages, but it's a losing battle. The brain chemistry of these patients has been so fundamentally altered by decades of disease that they can't tolerate long-term treatment. One by one, despite Sacks's best efforts, the patients slip back into their frozen states. Imagine experiencing this as a patient. You've been frozen, aware but unable to move, for 30 years. Then suddenly, miraculously, you're free. You can move, talk, laugh, cry. You reconnect with family members who've aged without you. You experience a world that's changed dramatically since you last participated in it. For a few beautiful months, you're alive again. And then the drugs stop working. You feel yourself slowing down. Your movements becoming more difficult. The prison walls closing in again. You know what's coming. You're going back to that frozen state, but now it's worse because you've tasted freedom. You know exactly what you're losing. Some patients beg to be allowed to die rather than return to that frozen existence. One patient, a woman named Rose, became so distressed as she felt herself freezing again that she tried to take her own life. This is the part of the story that's too dark for a Hollywood ending. Most of Sacks's patients eventually died, either from complications related to their condition or from old age, still frozen or partially frozen. The miracle of L-Dopa was temporary, a brief gift before the darkness returned. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, the last survivors of the Encephalitis Lethargica epidemic slowly die off. The youngest patients, those who were children in the 1920s, are now elderly in their 70s and 80s. Many have spent more than 50 years in their frozen state. By the year 2000, there are only a handful of survivors left worldwide. By 2010, they're virtually extinct. The last known survivor of the original epidemic may have died in the early 2000s, though exact records are difficult to confirm. An entire generation of victims, forgotten by history, vanished not with a bang but with a whimper. Most people today have never heard of Encephalitis lethargica. It's been overshadowed by other pandemics, other medical mysteries. But the disease hasn't completely disappeared. Here's something that should concern you. Encephalitis lethargica never completely went away. Since 1928, there have been sporadic reports of cases that closely resemble the original disease. They're rare, maybe a handful per year worldwide, but they exist. Patients developing sudden onset sleeping disorders combined with movement problems, psychiatric symptoms, and eye movement abnormalities. The exact constellation of symptoms that defined the original epidemic. In 2004, a study in the UK identified 20 cases of suspected encephalitis lethargica between 1997 and 2004. These patients hadn't traveled to exotic locations. They weren't exposed to unusual pathogens. They just developed the disease seemingly out of nowhere, just like patients in 1918. Most concerning, doctors still don't know how to treat it effectively. Some patients respond to immunotherapy or steroids, suggesting an autoimmune component. Others don't respond to anything. Some die. Others survive but are left with permanent neurological damage. In 2012, a small cluster of cases appeared in children in the United States. Kids who were perfectly healthy one day suddenly became lethargic, developed movement disorders, became like living dolls. Parents watched in horror as their children disappeared into the same disease that had stolen a generation a century earlier. And here's what makes this truly frightening. We're still no closer to understanding what causes it. We have better diagnostic tools now. We can see the brain inflammation on MRI scans. We can test for autoantibodies. But we still don't know the root cause. This is the question that haunts epidemiologists and neurologists. Could we see another epidemic of encephalitis lethargica? The honest answer is yes, it's possible. If we don't know what caused the original outbreak, we can't rule out it happening again. Maybe it was a virus that's still circulating in a dormant form. Maybe it was an autoimmune condition that could be triggered by another pandemic. Maybe environmental conditions in 1916 to 1928 created a perfect storm that could theoretically repeat. Think about the COVID-19 pandemic. One thing we've learned is that novel pathogens can emerge without warning and spread globally within months. We've also learned that neurological symptoms can accompany viral infections. COVID-19 itself causes neurological problems in some patients, brain fog, fatigue, changes in mental status. So far, we haven't seen COVID trigger encephalitis lethargica-like symptoms on a large scale, but the fact that a respiratory virus can attack the nervous system should give us pause. There's also the autoimmune angle. We're seeing more autoimmune diseases in general in modern populations. Some researchers think this is due to environmental factors, changes in diet, increased hygiene that alters our immune system development. If encephalitis lethargica was indeed autoimmune, then we might actually be more vulnerable to it now, not less. In 2023, researchers published a new study examining preserved brain tissue from encephalitis lethargica victims. Using modern molecular techniques, they found evidence of immune system activity and inflammation patterns consistent with autoimmune encephalitis. But they still couldn't identify a definitive trigger. There are scientists right now, today, working on this 100-year-old mystery. They're going through old medical records, re-examining preserved tissues, interviewing the families of survivors. They're trying to piece together what happened before it happens again. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. We got lucky that encephalitis lethargica stopped when it did. If it had continued for another decade, if it had infected 10 million people instead of 1 million, it could have crippled societies. Imagine losing an entire generation to a disease that turns them into living statues. Imagine the economic impact, the social impact, the psychological trauma of watching millions of people slip away into frozen consciousness. And we have no vaccine, no cure, no preventive measures. If it came back tomorrow, we'd be almost as helpless as doctors in 1918. Sure, we have better supportive care. We can use ventilators to keep patients breathing. We have feeding tubes and modern nursing care. We have L-Dopa, which might help some patients temporarily. But we can't stop it. We can't cure it. There's a small network of neurologists and researchers around the world who watch for encephalitis lethargica. They share information about suspicious cases. They try to identify patterns. When a patient presents with the right combination of symptoms, sleep disturbances, movement problems, eye movement abnormalities, they consider the possibility, however remote, that they're seeing the sleeping sickness. These doctors are like sentries watching for an enemy that might never come. But they know that if it does come, early recognition could make the difference between a contained outbreak and a global catastrophe. So what do we take away from the story of encephalitis lethargica? First, nature can surprise us in terrible ways. Diseases can appear without warning, spread globally, and vanish just as mysteriously. Our understanding of human biology and disease, despite all our advances, is still incomplete. We're walking through a dark forest, and we don't know what might be waiting in the shadows. Second, the most terrifying diseases aren't always the ones that kill. Encephalitis lethargica killed hundreds of thousands, yes, but it did something worse to hundreds of thousands more. It trapped them in a living death, aware but frozen, for decades. That kind of suffering is difficult for us to even comprehend. Third, we forget. The world moved on from encephalitis lethargica quickly. By the 1930s, it was already fading from public consciousness. Today, most people have never heard of it. But the survivors didn't forget. The families didn't forget. And we shouldn't forget, because forgetting means we're not prepared if it returns. Somewhere in the world right now, there might be a person developing the first symptoms of encephalitis lethargica. Fever, fatigue, overwhelming sleepiness. They'll go to a doctor, get diagnosed with the flu or mononucleosis or maybe just stress and exhaustion. They'll go home to rest. And maybe they'll recover. Or maybe they won't wake up. Maybe they'll become one of those rare modern cases that doctors puzzle over, trying to figure out if this is the sleeping sickness or something else. We don't know if Encephalitis lethargica will ever return in epidemic form. We don't know if it ever really left. We don't know what caused it or why it stopped. These questions remain open, more than a century later. What we do know is this: it happened once. A mysterious disease emerged from nowhere, turned millions of people into living statues, and then disappeared without explanation. It shattered families and destroyed lives in ways that are difficult to fully articulate. And unless we figure out what caused it, there's nothing to stop it from happening again. The next time you fall asleep at night, think about how precious that simple act is. Think about the intricate machinery in your brain that regulates sleep and wakefulness, that allows you to move when you want to move, to speak when you want to speak. For millions of people during the Encephalitis lethargica epidemic, that machinery broke down, and they were powerless to fix it. Sleep well, while you still can.